So we're finishing up the series that we've been doing. The Jedi returned on Friday, and some of us were witness to the return of the Jedi on Friday night. And so we've been looking at this idea of the hero's journey, of the apprentice's journey, of this coming to age, really the disciples' journey. And we've been tracing, there's George Lucas and his story, Star Wars, the saga there, the original one as we see that, and he really intentionally was trying to craft that story in a way that picked up these universal themes of myths and stories throughout time that really connect with not just the way stories are told, but I think the stories are told that way because that's the way life is lived and experienced. Sometimes we think that these stories are these artificial things, but I think that they resonate because they are very much connected to the way life is. We experience life as story. And we see these arcs, these narrative arcs in our own lives of obstacles and callings and how they get resolved in our lives and how it propels us and moves us forward. So Lucas was using Joseph Campbell. Go ahead and put his mug up there too. Joseph Campbell was a guy who analyzed these things, and he came up with what we call the monomyth, which was this idea of all of these different universal themes present. And he said not all of these themes are present in every story, but the majority of these themes are present in almost all stories. And so we have this kind of movement. We have the little diagram there. I put that up, Bruce, of the hero's journey. It begins with this call to adventure and this moving out. And we've got these slides as well. So we have the call to adventure, and we have Luke Skywalker. We've also been tracing Simon Peter's call as we've been looking at the story of Scripture and specifically about what it is to follow Jesus and his ups and downs as someone who has accepted that call and tried to live into this new life in Christ that he's received and make the connection with our own story. So it starts with this call to adventure, and sometimes it's rejected, sometimes we resist it, but there's something in us or outside of us that's propelling us on to something more. And we have to leave the known and step into the unknown. We have to leave our comfort. It may not mean physically leaving, but we have to leave behind our secure, stable way of viewing the world, way of living in the world, and step into some unknown new reality. And there's always kind of a risk involved in that. What's going to happen? Things are going to change. But if we want to be transformed, we need to leave what we know and step into that unknown. Often after the hero steps into that unknown, sometimes helped by a teacher or a mentor, someone who's plays that transitional role in their life, help them to make that journey, then they find themselves in the belly of the beast, and oftentimes real quickly. Go ahead and jump these there. We got, so the story of Jonah, or in Star Wars, right in the heart of the Death Star, but they find themselves fully removed from their past. There's something that happens that totally separates them from their past. They find themselves just fully in it, and they have to find their way out and find their way in the midst of all this. And also in these stories, there's what's called the road of trials. Oftentimes this is where transformation really begins. It's kind of a series of trials. We talk about Rocky, how he always has to lose the first fight and then go into training, and you have a musical montage that leads up to the big final conclusion where, of course, he wins. And that's all of the Rocky movies there in a plot line. Or we have Luke entering into this intentional training and the trials that he faces. He goes into the cave and he learns something about himself there and wrestles what that means. He rushes off and tries to face Vader on his own without his training being complete and ignoring the advice of his teachers, and he fails. He fails pretty miserably. And this is something that often happens is in these road trials. Some of them are failures. But what that ultimately leads to is this kind of death to self. You get to the end of yourself, you feel like you can't do it. And Tolkien was also a master of this. If you read The Lord of the Rings, we get Frodo just gets to the end of himself, and it's only with the help of his friend that he's able to get that last little bit, and even then he fails. And it's only because of the mercy he shows earlier. This is a totally different plot line to go through. But it's just we're not enough. There's not enough in us. In some heroic stories, the hero is able to find some inner reserve, but in many of them, they find that they get to the end of themselves. The term is apotheosis that Campbell uses. This idea that it's either a literal death or a death to self. And we saw that last week. We talked about Peter's denials And that image that Carol found, this idea that you can either go backwards to nothing, or you can go forward knowing that failure is a definite, but on the other side, it's got failure 1 mile ahead, but success is 1.5 miles in the same direction. That success is really only on the other side of that failure. That's a death to self. And Jesus says it that way. He says, you want to follow me, you have to take up your cross, you have to die. You have to lose your life so you can find it. And so this kind of losing of life, and in the movies with Luke, that was a kind of letting go, being faced with the temptation, faced with his own failure and his ability, he gives himself up. He lets go, and he falls, literally. But then there's what happens afterwards. It's never the end of the story. And that's what we're going to look at today, is kind of how these stories kind of take that turn, how we get to that last part. So we're going to see a clip here of really the resolution of 2 stories. We've been talking about Luke and his coming of age, and we'll see him coming into his own in this. Really specifically denying or making a different choice than he did before when he clung to his weapons, kind of like Simon Peter taking the sword and cutting off the high priest's ear, trying to do it in his own strength and failing, just like Luke tried to do. But now we see him making a different choice and going a different direction, really coming into his own as a Jedi in this case. And then we'll look at Peter kind of maybe coming into his own a little bit as well. But we also see that there's a second plot line, and I'll talk about that after the clip. But this really arcs over the first 6 movies, also the original trilogy, that we also see someone else's journey coming to a resolution. So we're going to watch this clip here, and there's a little jump in the middle of it. So if it jumps on us, there we are. An active confrontation. Like the 5th or 6th time that someone's got their hand cut off, and he realizes it's been cut off before, and he recognizes that.
Your hate has made you powerful. Now, fulfill your destiny. Take your father's place at my side.
His hand was cut off by his father earlier.
Never. I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me. So be it, Jedi.
Jump ahead.
You will not be dead. You will be destroyed. Young fool. Only now, at the end, do you understand? Your feeble skills are no match for the power of the dark side. You will pay the price for your lack of vision. Now, Luke Skywalker, you will die.
So we see that there's not only Luke coming into his own, Luke becoming who he was intended to be, but there's also the resolution and really redemption of Anakin Skywalker, his father, Darth Vader. And it's interesting, the Christ-like themes that are in here. And they're all over the place, and you'll find them in a lot of literature because, again, I think this story is at the heart of creation. This story is woven into the way things are, and we resonate with it and we see it. And here we see it in a couple different ways. One, we see Luke standing up to evil and refusing to fight back. And we have, like the one who stood before his accusers and like a sheep before his shearers was silent, so he did not open his mouth. And Jesus willingly accepted the punishment, the evil that was poured out on him, rather than resisting it as he could have. So we have him coming into his own, into what really it means. A new understanding of power, a new understanding of authority, a new understanding of the way life is supposed to be lived. But we also see the self-sacrifice of Darth Vader, of Anakin, for the love of his son, not being willing to stand by. And so he intervenes, he steps in, and he sacrifices himself and eventually dies because of the wounds that he takes. So we see that self-sacrifice of love. And so it's the redemption of his journey where he has failed, where he has fallen really far, and has now come back. And there's actually in this monomyth, Peter Campbell talks about atonement with the Father. That is, and Joseph Campbell, sorry. Atonement with the Father is one of these things that has to happen. It's calling out and dealing with the force that has ultimately been the shaping, but also resisting force. Sometimes it's a father figure, sometimes it's something else. But he has to come to grips with it. He has to be resolved with it. So we see that in this story here for Luke, and then for Anakin coming back to his true self after all of his failures. We see him becoming the hero he was intended to be. So that's the resolution of this story. But as we will find out in 2014 or 2015, there's going to be another Star Wars movie coming out, and this is just the beginning of another story. As with all things, there's not really a full resolution. There's an end to this arc, but what goes on in these characters' lives as they continue to grow. We're going to see the same thing in the biblical text as we come to Simon Peter. There's going to be kind of some resolution here, but also these hints of new beginning, and in some ways kind of a patterning off of the original call. So we're going to turn now to John chapter 21. And we're going to see in Simon Peter's life this kind of resolution that he has. So I'm going to read the text, and then I'm going to read something else I'll share in a minute. But we're going to read 21 through 19, verse 1 through 19. Afterward, Jesus appeared again to his disciples by the Sea of Galilee. It happened this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, also known as Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. "I'm going out to fish," Simon Peter told them, and they said, "We'll go with you." So they went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples did not realize that it was Jesus. He called out to them, "Friends, haven't you any fish?" "No," they answered. He said, "Throw your net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." When they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It is the Lord." As soon as Simon Peter heard him say, "It is the Lord," he wrapped his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, towing the net full of fish, for they were not far from shore, about 100 yards. And when they landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it, and some bread. And Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish you have just caught." Simon Peter climbed aboard and dragged the net ashore. It was full of large fish, 153. But even with so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples dared ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them, and did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Lord," he said. "You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my lambs." Again, Jesus said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" He answered, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Jesus said, "Take care of my sheep." The third time he said to him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, "Do you love me?" He said, "Lord, you know all these things. You know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. And then he said to him, "Follow me." A few years ago, actually quite a few years ago now, I wrote a little monologue about this text. This has been a story, a text that I've resonated with, and I find myself resonating again now. This idea of what is Peter going through right now? There's still obviously a lot of unresolved stuff that Jesus is coming in and really wading right into the middle of. And so I know that he must have been really torn. And this monologue, I tried to kind of capture that. So I want to read that. This kind of retelling of the story, but really from Peter's point of view, from how I imagine he's thinking. "I felt like I was being torn in two. The joy was contagious, filling me to overflowing. Jesus was alive. We had seen him die, seen the tomb where he was buried. We had thought it was all over, but he rose from the dead. It was incredible. It changed everything. It meant that it would never end. Even death could not hold him." But as the disciples laughed and celebrated, talking excitedly about what would happen next, I knew that I had no place with them anymore. Not after what I had done. So one evening while they were talking about what we should do, I stood up and announced simply, "I'm going fishing." I needed to escape the thoughts and memories and the dull routine of hard physical labor. I needed to return to the life I had led before Jesus had come. The life I would return to now that I had turned my back on Jesus. With nothing else to do, the Zebedee brothers and some of the others followed my lead and got in the boats with me. The familiar waves beneath my feet were soothing. The endless repetition calmed my nerves and quieted my mind. I lost myself in the endless rhythm, throwing out the net, pulling it back in, throwing it out again. We caught nothing, but I didn't care. The sun had broken the horizon and some of the others were already heading in when I finally stowed the nets and let James and John row us in. But before we got to shore, we saw a figure, silhouetted against the rising sun. He called out to us, asking if we had caught any fish. James shouted back, "No, it was a waste of a night." Then the man told us to try one more time, throwing off the right side of the boat. Without thinking, I grabbed my net and threw where he had directed. And I was shocked to feel the nets straining to pull out of my grasp. They were filled with fish, a catch the like of which I had only seen one other time in all my years of fishing. I looked up at John, who was grinning excitedly back at me. He also remembered that other miraculous catch, the first time we had met Jesus. John is the one who said it out loud. "It's him, Peter. It's the Lord." Before I could think through what I was doing, I wrapped my cloak around me and dove into the sea. I swam all the way to shore and ran towards Jesus. I was about 10 feet away when I remembered. The reality of who I was and what I had done came crashing back in. I could see the fire, smell the breakfast he was preparing, but I couldn't look him in the face. So I just stood there, shivering and dripping, just out of the reach of the fire's warmth and the joy of the other disciples when they finally dragged the net to shore and came rushing up to greet the Lord. I stayed on the outside of the circle while they ate and talked. After a while, I heard someone approaching. I thought it was James or John bringing me some breakfast and was ready to tell them to leave me alone. I was far from hungry. But then I heard his voice, the Master, Jesus. He said, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" My answer was automatic. Of course, Lord, you know I love you. But in my mind, I could hear my own voice echoing back to me from my memory. I am not one of his disciples. Then he said, feed my lambs. Before I could figure out what he meant, he asked again, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And again I answered, you know I love you, Lord. And again, the memory rose up within me. I do not know this man. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. And then I understood, for he asked me a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He was mocking me. He knew about my denials. Of course he knew. He told me I would deny him. This was just his way of exposing me for a failure and a liar, and I deserved every bit of his wrath. But still the anger rose within me, and I looked up at him to tell him to leave me alone. But when I looked into his eyes, I did not see judgment. There was no condemnation, no anger, no rebuke. There was only love. Endless love. The question was real. The offer genuine. He didn't care about my past failure. He only wanted to know if I loved him now. And if I did, he was willing to give me a place in his work again. I fell at his feet and cried, Lord, you know all things. Surely you know that I love you. He raised me to my feet and smiled at me. Feed my sheep, he told me. The joy that rose in me was indescribable, but I was also terrified and overwhelmed. Who was I to do his work? I would certainly fail again. I wasn't worthy or able to take care of those who belonged to him. How could I even begin to fulfill this command? Before I could ask the questions that were brimming in me, he spoke once more. He told me how I would fulfill his desires. It was the first thing he'd ever said to me. Just 2 words. Jesus said, follow me. I really resonate with Peter's sense, because I know I've been there. I know I've failed. I know that I've made mistakes. I know that there have been times when I felt like I need to hide, that I've been unable to go and really be honest with God in prayer because I felt ashamed. I felt like I would be judged or sent away. And to remember and be amazed with the idea that God would accept me, even now, even after all I've done, is really incredible. As we come and as we look at this text, we realize that it has all these parallels with that first calling, that first miraculous catch. Go ahead and go back. We'll walk through this in a minute. It's really, there's a second calling and a miraculous catch. It's just like the first call. But this time there's a difference. Remember, the first time when Simon realized that it was the Lord and that he was this holy man and had caused this miraculous catch, he went up to Jesus and he said, go away from me, for I am a sinful man. I can't stand in your holiness. And this time, instead of pulling away from Jesus, Peter is impelled to dive in the water and go to him. And then they have this breakfast on the shore where Jesus invites them to contribute to the meal. I find that very human. Not only is he sitting there, it's been a long, frustrating night, it's been fruitless, they haven't been able to do what they've set out to do. Jesus gives them direction. Not only does he give them success, but more importantly, he invites them to have a meal with him. And where did he get the bread and the fish that he's bringing? But he also invites them to contribute. He could have fed them, he could have multiplied the food, but he says, bring some of the fish that you've caught. He allows us to have a part in his work. We're invited to bring something to him, though of course they have nothing to bring except for what he allowed them to catch. But still, this idea that we're invited to be a part of what Jesus is doing and to have this meal with him. And the setting is interesting. The specific detail that Jesus is cooking over a charcoal fire. It's only a couple chapters earlier when Peter is warming himself before a charcoal fire and denying that he even knows Jesus and the servants around who recognize him. So it's the very setting of his failure. It's his old life that he's left behind. It's right by the charcoal fire where he had so drastically failed and denied Jesus. It's right there in the midst of that Jesus meets with him again and invites him in. And what does he say to him? He probes that wound. He gives him the opportunity to undo his 3 denials. He's lancing the wound like a great physician he is, so it doesn't get infected. He knows that festers, that disappointment, that shame is going to destroy him and keep him from being the person that Jesus wants him to be and wants to use. So he lances the wound and he deals with the sin so that Peter can move on. But notice it starts by calling him by name again. And he's calling him by his previous name, Simon, son of John. Even that address, when he has changed his name, he's given him this new name, Peter, the Rock. Bob was telling me before, I had mentioned this before, I didn't bring it up a couple weeks ago, but when he calls him the Rock, there is a difference in the words that he uses when he talks about Peter and when he talks about this rock that he's going to build the church on. They're kind of a derivative, and in some ways it's almost like he's a chip off the old block. That Jesus is the foundation and the cornerstone that he's going to build on, but Peter is going to be like him. And he's a chip off the old block. But he's going to be this foundation later Peter will say, we are all living stones being built up into the house of God. But he doesn't call him that. He calls him Simon. He calls him by his previous name. He's calling back to him. Peter has gone back. In his mind and physically, he's gone back. And Jesus meets him and calls him again. He says, Simon. And then he just asks the question, do you love me? It's the question that we all get asked again and again. Regardless of what's happened in the past, Jesus comes to us now and he asks us one question. Do you love me? Now in the Greek, in this whole text, John often uses pairs of words interchangeably. We'll see that with feed or tend, sheep and lambs, even 2 different words for know in this passage and some other things. But a lot of people have pointed out that there's actually 2 different words for love being used in this passage. And I think generally they're used interchangeably. If there is any significance to it, it's one of development. Because Jesus is using this word agape, which is the sacrificial love. But in some ways it's kind of maybe a colder concept. Do you love me? Do you love me in this sacrificial way, in this all-consuming kind of way? And Peter answers, I do love you, but he uses the word philoi, which is where we get, like Philadelphia is the city of brotherly love. Philoi is more this kind of warm affection. I don't know if Peter was kind of rejecting the colder, more clinical kind of love and saying, no, I love you like a brother. And then the second time again, Jesus uses agape and Peter uses philoi. And some people have said that Peter's, either that he's trying to be really warm instead of cold, or that he's not sure that he can live up to that statement of I sacrificially love you. Then the last time, Jesus actually changes and says, do you philoi? Do you love me? With that kind of warm brotherly love. And Peter again says, yes, I do. And some said, well, Jesus is accommodating him. He's saying, okay, I'll accept this lesser love for now. But then he'll go on and explain, that may be now, but I tell you the truth. Someday you will be led where you don't want to go. And he's talking about the death that Peter will eventually have. So even if you don't sacrificially love me now, or aren't willing to say that, or you don't think you can, you will. So whether there's a lot of significance to that or not, I'm not sure, but ultimately both are going to be involved. Peter professes his warm kind of emotional love for him, but he will in his life also express the sacrificial love as he lays down his life. He actually was crucified, and because he didn't want to be crucified and die in the same way Jesus did, he didn't think he was worthy of that, he was actually crucified upside down. So there's actually, St. Peter's cross. You can go places in Rome and places where we have St. Peter's cross. It's actually an upside down cross. And we usually see that and think of something negative, but it's actually because he did not view himself to be worthy to die in the same manner that Jesus did. That's what tradition at least teaches us. So whether or not there's a lot of significance to it or not, there is a sense in which this love that he is asking for is both warm affection, but also a love that is strong enough to carry us through even sacrificing, even offering up our lives, this dying to ourselves that we've talked about in the disciples' journey, that is going to be required. Bonhoeffer again said the call to follow Jesus is the call to come and die. So this kind of love, this thing that he's asking about, is not just a warm, fuzzy feeling, but a commitment to give ourselves for Jesus. It's interesting, the first time he asked him, do you love me more than these? Well, this has been an issue for Peter. Peter has been brash in saying, even if everybody falls away, I'll never fall away. I'll die for you. He's already said he'd give up his life for him, but then instead, he betrays him, and, there's maybe even a little bit of probing in that first question at Peter's pride. Is he going to say once again, yes, more than all of these? And Peter doesn't. This time Peter, a little more humble, just speaks for himself. He doesn't try to gauge other people's love. And again, there's that sense in which his earlier claim that I would die for you, he's already failed on that. And though again, I think Jesus is saying, you will eventually, just not now. Yeah?
Don't you think when he cut off the high priest's servant's ear,
Yeah.
it was
Yeah.
sure death for him right
Oh yeah,
there?
he was attempting to. Yeah, so I'm willing to lay down, and he, so he does. He's impetuous. He actually dives into the ocean. He cuts off the servant's ear. He tries to, but he still, again, that's another situation where he still doesn't get it. Doesn't get what this kingdom really involves, and he ends up getting rebuked again, just like when he tried to tell Jesus, you can't die. And he gets rebuked, get behind me, Satan. Now he tries to fight and for Jesus, even when Jesus says, I could fight for myself if I wanted to. But I shall not accept the cup the Father's given me. So he gets rebuked again. And it's probably more out of confusion rather than lack of, at that point, that he runs away. But then, in the midst of all that, I don't know what to do anymore. He ends up denying that he even knows Jesus. So his earlier boldness led him in the wrong direction, and now he doesn't know what to do, and he finds himself afraid, and he denies even knowing Jesus. So he has failed on that. He made a good attempt, you're right, or he would have been willing to, but he didn't understand what was really required. But as Jesus comes to us, I said he comes to us each and every day. He comes again, he asks the same question, do you love me? And if we say yes, he has something for us to do. He says, feed my lambs, tend my sheep, feed my sheep. Again, I don't think there's too much to try to figure out why he uses the different words in different ways. But essentially he says, do my work for me, work for me. They're not your sheep, they're my sheep. And you're to take care of them for me. I want you to be involved in my work. This is the way God has approached humanity since he created humanity, to be involved in and part of what he is doing in the world. And it's interesting because earlier the call, he says, I will make you fishers of men. He takes what they're doing and he says, I'm going to change what you're doing. Now he says, I'm going to make you a shepherd, an under shepherd. I'm going to take me, I'm the good shepherd, and you're going to do my job now. And it's very interesting. Do you know the phrase by hook or by crook? You realize that this is where that comes from. Because Peter was called to be a fisher of men, use a hook, get people. Now he's being called to also be a shepherd and have the shepherd's crook. So they're saying at this point they're adding to Jesus or to Peter's responsibilities not only to be the fisher of men, but also to take care of the sheep. And so by hook or by crook, he is going to do and live out the calling that Jesus has placed on him. So that's That's where that phrase comes from, is that he's gonna fill out the role by whichever means is necessary. At this point, am I calling people who don't know Jesus to come to know him, or am I taking care of those that already do know him? By hook or by crook, accomplish the calling that Jesus has called
It's
for.
funny, crook doesn't mean what I thought it did.
Yeah, shepherd's crook. Yeah, not hook or by criminal. And so finally, out of all of that, there's a sense in which he wants us to be involved in his work. And how do we go about doing that? He doesn't necessarily give him a list of instructions. He simply says, follow me. It's the very original calling, again, down by the seashore. Just follow me. And so there's a sense in which I'm not sending you out on your own. Just follow me. Even now, after resurrection, after Jesus is leaving them, he sends the Spirit to be with us, and we're not on our own. So we're not Peter's not dependent on, well, what you've learned in the past, or now you're in and of yourself strong enough to go. I've said this before. The goal of the disciples' life is not independence. It's learned dependence. It's to be more dependent, more aware of our dependence on God in all of life. He's not trying to build us up to the point where now he can wave goodbye and we go off on our own. That's never the goal of the spiritual life. That's not God's intention for us. He doesn't want us to outgrow him. He wants us to dig deeper into our awareness of our need for him. And so even as we are sent out to be a part of God's work, it's not something that happens after we've finished maturing and now God can use us. Peter's way back at square one here. And yeah, he's got other experiences and stuff, but he's hurt, he's broken, he's just starting to be put together. And God's not saying, well, once you've healed for a little while, once I kind of put you back through a rehab process for a little while, once you kind of have taken a few more classes and learned a little bit more, then you can sign up to serve underneath somebody and work your way back up. He says, I'm going to use you now. And really, it's in our brokenness and our awareness of our brokenness, that's the training to be able to do the job he's calling us to. Because if Peter tries to jump out and do it in his own strength, the way he thinks it can be done, he's going to grab a sword again. And we're going to have problems again. So he's saying, now that I've broken of you of this attempt to try to do this in your own strength, to do it your own way, are you willing to simply follow me? Follow the example I set, and follow me as I lead each step of the way. So there's one question, there's one call. Do you love me? And if so, then follow me. Do my work and do it the way I would do it as you follow me. So as we think of our own stories now, as we think about this, we've seen in the saga that Lucas wrote, we're seeing now in the story here and in Simon Peter's. Of course, this isn't the end of Peter's story either. We read on in the book of Acts and we see he still makes some mistakes. He still has to be challenged from time to time. Paul has to stand up to his face and say, you're dead wrong on this. He goes back and forth. He has some problems, but he does become a key leader in the early church as you read the book of Acts. And for us, as we come to that same place, we have to realize we have to acknowledge our own failures. We have to make sure that we don't let these disappointments and failures and our own shame fester and get infected. One commentator wrote, he said, no matter how desperate our failure or how deep-seated our shame, he can forgive and renew us and then use us in his service. Failure is never final with God. So he's right there in the midst of it. And right in the very same place, the same setting, the same thing. But right where you failed, that's where he's there again saying, do you love me? Get back on the horse. If you say yes, he's got a job for you to do, because love is proven through service. It's not just a commitment. It's not just something we say. It's something that we have to live out through living a life following him. Rita Snowden said this, so you can ask me what forgiveness means. It is the wonder of being trusted again by God in the place where I disgraced him. Thinking about this, and N.T. Wright tells a story about a guest who was eager to help clean up after a meal, and he's drying dishes and he's cleaning dishes with them again, and he grabs a cut glass pitcher that they had just received, and he's turning, and he doesn't realize that person was turning at the same time, and the result is shattered glass all over the floor. and N.T. Wright and his wife thinking, trying to not let their disappointment or their frustration show and trying to be gracious. And how he asked again and again, I'm so sorry, I'm so sorry. But then they invited him back. And after the meal, they invited him to help clean up. They gave him a towel. And that was restoration. You can say, it's not a big deal. You can say, you're forgiven. But it's when you hand him another piece of precious china. That's when they know that they've been restored. So that's what's happening here. It's not just forgiveness for our past mistakes. Jesus brings us right back to the same place. And he says, here's another chance. It's the kid who's dropped your iPad on the floor and broken the screen. And this is just an example. I'm pulling out of the air. It hasn't happened in our house or anything. It's letting them use it again the next time they want to use it. Yeah, do you have a similar?
Well, I don't know if this is true. I guess it's supposed to be true. When Thomas Edison invented the first light bulb, he handed it to his assistant to carry over somewhere, and the kid dropped it.
Oh,
and
no.
It hadn't even been turned on yet. So then they did another one, and again he handed it to the kid to take it, and this time he made it.
Instead of
I don't
doing
know
it
if that's
himself,
true, but-
holding on to himself, so
Yeah.
I've had the exact same problem. Like one time I was at my dad's house and I had the iPad in a case.
Yeah.
And the iPad wasn't secure and I was holding it the wrong way, so it was no covering at the bottom.
Okay.
So it slipped out of the case and so the edge shattered from the concrete floor and so it
Yeah.
shattered.
Yeah. Are you allowed to play with the iPad anymore? Yeah, but he still lets you. That's forgiveness. That's grace. And that's new beginnings. That's really what is happening in this story. Again, it's not about just a full resolution. This is a new beginning. This is a new start. And Peter's going to go off, and again, ups and downs as he follows Jesus from this point on. But he's being restored. And if Jesus hadn't probed that, if Jesus hadn't gone there and forced him to face that and shown, I still trust you with the calling that I've given you, could Peter have gone on? Or would he have just stayed and fished and gone back to his old life? In order to do that, God has to bring us back sometimes to the very point of our failure. And we need to be willing to go with him and realize that instead of condemnation, he just stands there and says, do you love me? And there's a new start, there's a new beginning that can happen right there if you say yes. And he involves you in what he's doing. Just an example of this is how there's these new beginnings start. Go ahead and put the next thing on. This is the idea that the road isn't over. It's not resolution. There's Tolkien again. I quoted him earlier. This road goes ever on. We don't know where it's going to end. It's always going. There's no tight, and they lived happily ever after in real stories. There's the next thing. Go ahead and put the next thing up there. So this idea of tension and resolution. I took a class from a guy named Jeremy Begbie. He's a theologian and a musician, classically trained musician, incredible musician. Brilliant little Brit. He's a small guy with a ton of energy. He's just really fun to learn from. But he talked about doing theology through the arts and exploring theological themes by looking at the arts and what they are and what they involve. And so he was talking about time and music, and this idea of promise and fulfillment and intention and resolution. That in classical pieces, really in all music, there's a sense in which there's an arc, there's a theme that comes and is repeated and then is resolved. And then often that theme is repeated and goes, and there's several arcs, and the same kind of theme is repeated several times, sometimes with a little bit of a variation, but there's a larger arc going through the whole piece. Even as these little things are resolved, something else is being introduced, and there's a new arc starting. And so you kind of see at the smaller level, and then at the bigger level, these arc things, and it's all part of the whole piece that's arcing on into the future. And some pieces have that sense of resolution at the end, where all of the small and medium and big arcs are all kind of coming together in one great theme. All of these things are resolved. But some of them have one little bit that's unresolved, or one little bit that keeps pushing you forward, that leaves not quite, not everything wrapped up tightly, that it's moving on into the next thing. Bruce talks about seeing the musician Phil Cagey. He's a guitar player, and he would have a little foot thing where he would actually do just a little sequence of notes and stuff like that, and he would record it, record himself live, and then he'd start playing it back, and he'd play something else over it. So he got that same thing going, but now he introduces a new thing. And so you have this richness that comes in music when you have multiple different themes that are being resolved and new ones started all the time. And that's what life is really like. When you have things are resolving, even as this gospel, the Gospel of John, is coming to a close, John's resolving some of these outstanding things, these things that are in tension. What's going to happen with Peter? And what's that going to look like? So he's resolving and tying some of those things up. But in the same sense, he's starting something new. He's introducing a new theme. This new theme of following the Good Shepherd, not just being a fisher of man, but now following the Good Shepherd. There's something new that's being introduced. It's going to be playing out beyond the end of the piece of the Gospel of John, at least. It's not the end of Simon Peter's stories. It's just a new beginning. And he will go on and do that through the ups and downs. And for us, we're at the same place in our own lives at different times. And really, as we think about the life of this church, as things are coming to a close, we're going to do our best to celebrate, give thanks, to kind of try to bring some sense of resolution. But at the same time, there's going to be new themes that God is introducing into our lives. There's new things that he's starting to do, and we need to be listening for what those are. Be quick to obey, the same way Peter was. We said, throw the net off the other side. Just do it. And so even as we're kind of seeing some things kind of resolve, and there's a lot that's going on with that, I think some of you are already starting to see that, where these new themes, these new possibilities, new doors opening, that you're starting to see. That God's not wrapping things up and it's just going to be done. He's got new chapters of his story, new movements to the piece, the masterpiece that is your life. They're just starting. So we need to be listening for those themes and quick to obey. And in all that, we just fall back on Jesus' question. Do you love me? And his call to all who answer yes, to participate in his ongoing work in the world. And again, how? What if we mess up? What if we get lost or confused or find we can't do it? And he comes to us again and again with that question and with that call and with the simple means to how to fulfill it. It's just follow me. Let's pray. God, we thank you that you come to us, and not just the scrubbed up version of ourselves that we sometimes bring to you, but you want to come to us in those places of brokenness, those places of shame, those places that we have felt like we can't let you into, that you come and you probe and you want to go right to the heart of the wound. And right there, you want to ask us the question. You want to give us the new chance to tell our story in a different way, to move it forward and not be captured by what's happened in the past, but to come into that experience of pain, of brokenness, of failure, of shame, and you just ask, not how could you have done this? Do you realize what you've done? No, you just ask, do you love me? That's enough. If we say yes, you can bring us forward into a new day. You can bring us into something new. So help us to hear that question. Help us to be quick to respond. Help us to be listening for those new notes, those new themes that you're bringing into our lives, that we might follow them to wherever you're going to lead. We pray all this in Jesus' name. Amen.